G.K. Chesterton read a lot of books. He mostly read books that started with the assumption that Christianity had had its day, and that, at least in the West, we had outgrown it. At the start, he was open to all these new ideas. But as he read and read, he had the sense that there was something off in all this modern thinking. Basically, what was in those books ran against all the lessons that he had learned in the nursery. The main thing that Chesterton wants to get across in this second part of the chapter called the Ethics of Elfland is that the moral structure embedded in fairy tales is consistent with reality, with the lived experience of ordinary people over many generations. And this reality can be found in fairy tales. Here's Chesterton. My first and last philosophy, that which I believe in with unbroken certainty, I learnt in the nursery. I generally learnt it from a nurse. That is, from the solemn and star-appointed priestess, at once of democracy and tradition. The things I believed most then, the things I believe most now, are the things called fairy tales. They seem to me to be the entirely reasonable things. They are not fantasies. Compared with them, other things are fantastic. Compared with them, religion and rationalism are both abnormal, though religion is abnormally right and rationalism abnormally wrong. Fairyland is nothing but the sunny country of common sense. It is not earth that judges heaven, but heaven that judges earth. So for me at least, it was not earth that criticized Elfland, but Elfland that criticized the earth. I knew the magic beanstalk before I had tasted beans. I was sure of the man in the moon before I was certain of the moon. This was all one with popular tradition. Modern minor poets are naturalists and talk about the bush or the brook. But the singers of the old epics and fables were supernaturalists and talked about the gods of brook and bush. That's what the moderns mean when they say that the ancients did not appreciate nature because they said that nature was divine. Old nurses do not tell children about the grass, but about the fairies that dance on the grass. And the old Greeks could not see the trees for the dryads. In Victorian England, a nurse or nanny was a woman who was hired to take care of the family's children. The nursery was several rooms dedicated to the children's upbringing and care. It was usually upstairs. Chesterton's philosophy of life was established in the nursery. And central to that philosophy of life were the profound lessons that he gleaned from fairy tales. He argues that fairy tales contain more truth than religion or rationalism, because they are rooted in the common sense of the common people. And so a lowly nurse who knows a lot about fairies knows a lot about the essentials of the philosophy of common sense. But I deal here with what ethic and philosophy come from being fed on fairy tales. If I were describing them in detail, I could note many noble and healthy principles that arise from them. There is the chivalrous lesson of Jack the Giant Killer, that giants should be killed because they are gigantic. It is a manly mutiny against pride as such. For the rebel is older than all the kingdoms, and the Jacobin has more tradition than the Jacobite. There is the lesson of Cinderella, which is the same as that of the Magnificat, exalta vit humiles. There is the great lesson of Beauty and the Beast, that a thing must be loved before it is lovable. There is the terrible allegory of the Sleeping Beauty, which tells how the human creature was blessed with all birthday gifts, yet cursed with death, and how death also may perhaps be softened to a sleep. But I am not concerned with any of the separate statutes of Elfland, but with the whole spirit of its law, which I learnt before I could speak, and shall retain when I cannot write. I am concerned with a certain way of looking at life, which was created in me by the fairy tales, but has since been meekly ratified by the mere facts. Fairy tales have all kinds of lessons in them, and Chesterton gives us a quick rundown of some of the common sense wisdom that can be found in individual tales. Pride must be destroyed. The humble will eventually be raised up. A person won't be lovable until they are loved. That life is full of good things, but death is at the end for us all. And the precept that death might not be as bad as we suppose. Fairy tales are full of such wisdom, but these particulars aren't the kinds of things that Chesterton wants to focus on. He wants to explore the foundational ideas of all the folk tales, the worldview of Elfland, if you will. It may be stated this way. There are certain sequences or developments, cases of one thing following another, which are, in the true sense of the word, reasonable. They are, in the true sense of the word, necessary. Such are mathematical and merely logical sequences. We in fairyland, who are the most reasonable of all creatures, admit that reason and that necessity. For instance, if the ugly sisters are older than Cinderella, it is, in an iron and awful sense, necessary that Cinderella is younger than the ugly sisters. There is no getting out of it. Hegel may talk as much fatalism about the fact as he pleases. It really must be. If Jack is the son of a miller, the miller is the father of Jack. Cold reason decrees it from her awful throne, and we in fairyland must submit. If the three brothers all ride horses, there are 6 animals and 18 legs involved. That is true rationalism, and fairyland is full of it. But as I put my head over the hedge of the elves and began to take notice of the natural world, I observed an extraordinary thing. I observed that learned men in spectacles were talking of the actual things that happened, dawn and death and so on, as if they were rational and inevitable. They talked as if the fact that trees bear fruit were just as necessary as the fact that 2 and 1 trees make 3. But it is not. There is an enormous difference by the test of fairyland, which is the test of the imagination. You cannot imagine 2 and 1 not making 3, but you can easily imagine trees not growing fruit. You can imagine them growing golden candlesticks or tigers hanging on by the tail. These men in spectacles spoke much of a man named Newton, who was hit by an apple and who discovered a law. But they could not be got to see the distinction between a true law, a law of reason, and the mere fact of apples falling. If the apple hit Newton's nose hit the apple. That is a true necessity, because we cannot conceive the one occurring without the other, but we can quite well conceive the apple not falling on his nose. We can fancy it flying ardently through the air to hit some other nose, of which it had a more definite dislike. We have always in our fairy tales kept this sharp distinction between the science of mental relations, in which there really are laws, and the science of physical facts, in which there are no laws but only weird repetitions. We believe in bodily miracles, but not in mental impossibilities. We believe that a beanstalk climbed up to heaven, but that does not at all confuse our convictions on the philosophical question of how many beans make 5. Chesterton starts by explaining that reason comes in 2 forms. The first might be called logical necessities. 2 plus 2 make 4, or a triangle must have 3 sides, no more and no less. Fairy tales, he explains, are rational in that they do not break the laws of logic. This counters the silly idea that fairy tales are pure nonsense. No, they have sense. They obey the laws of logic. But this category of logical necessity is not all there is to reason. And some pretty smart people fail to realize this. They fail to realize that a tree bearing fruit is not a necessity in the same way that the number of beans in Jack's hand was 5 because that's how many he had. The 5 beans being 5 beans is a law of logic. The tree bearing fruit is a wonderful fact. There is a difference between the laws of nature and the laws of logic. That being that the laws of nature are not really laws at all. They are just weird repetitions. We can imagine them being broken, and when they are in reality, we call them miracles. That's the test, right? The imagination test. If you can't imagine it any other way, it's a law of logic. If you can, it's not a law. It's a marvelous fact. Here is the peculiar perfection of tone and truth in the nursery tales. The man of science says, "Cut the stalk and the apple will fall." But he says it calmly, as if the one idea really led up to the other. The witch in the fairy tale says, "Blow the horn and the ogre's castle will fall." But she does not say it as if it were something in which the effect obviously arose out of the cause. Doubtless she has given the advice to many champions, and has seen many castles fall, but she does not lose either her wonder or her reason. She does not muddle her head until it imagines a necessary mental connection between a horn and a falling tower. But the scientific men do muddle their heads until they imagine a necessary mental connection between an apple leaving the tree and an apple reaching the ground. They do really talk as if they had found not only a set of marvelous facts, but a truth connecting those facts. They do talk as if the connection of two strange things physically connected them philosophically. They feel that because one incomprehensible thing constantly follows another incomprehensible thing, the two together somehow make up a comprehensible thing. Two black riddles make a white answer. Chesterton's point is that our scientific way of thinking has come to conflate the two laws. We think that the laws of nature are the same kind of thing as the laws of logic, but they are two very different things. For one thing, only one of them is a law, the law of logic. The laws of nature are not laws. They simply describe observable patterns that happen to happen. These are not things that must happen. Fairy tales frequently break these patterns. In them, pumpkins become carriages, frogs turn into princes, and some children actually listen to their parents. But in these fantastic tales, the laws of logic still hold. Pumpkin may become a carriage, but it can't become a carriage and stay a pumpkin at the same time. Fairy tales cheerfully break the laws of nature, but they never break the laws of thought. Even magic must still make sense. In fairyland, we avoid the word law, but in the land of science, they are singularly fond of it. Thus, they will call some interesting conjecture about how forgotten folk pronounce the alphabet Grimm's Law. But Grimm's Law is far less intellectual than Grimm's fairy tales. The tales are, at any rate, certainly tales, while the law is not a law. A law implies that we know the nature of the generalization and enactment, not merely that we have noticed some of the effects. If there is a law that pickpockets shall go to prison, it is implied that there is an imaginable mental connection between the idea of prison and the idea of picking pockets. And we know what the idea is. We can say why we take the liberty of a man who takes liberties. But we cannot say why an egg can turn into a chicken, any more than we can say why a bear could turn into a fairy prince. As ideas, the egg and the chicken are further off from each other than the bear and the prince, for no egg in itself suggests a chicken, whereas some princes do suggest bears. Granted, then, that certain transformations do happen, it is essential that we should regard them in the philosophical manner of fairy tales, not in the unphilosophic manner of science and the laws of nature. When we are asked why eggs turn into birds or fruits fall in autumn, we must answer exactly as the fairy godmother would answer if Cinderella asked why mice turned into horses or her clothes fell from her at 12 o'clock. We must answer that it is magic. It is not a law, for we do not understand its general formula. It is not a necessity, for though we can count on it happening practically, we have no right to say that it must always happen. It is no argument for unalterable law, as Huxley fancied, that we count on the ordinary course of things. We do not count on it. We bet on it. We risk the remote possibility of a miracle as we do that of a poisoned pancake or a world-destroying comet. We leave it out of account, not because it is a miracle, and therefore an impossibility, but because it is a miracle, and therefore an exception. All the terms used in the science books, law, necessity, order, tendency, and so on, are really unintellectual, because they assume an inner synthesis which we do not possess. The only words that ever satisfied me as describing nature are the terms used in the fairy books: charm, spell, enchantment. They express the arbitrariness of the fact and its mystery. A tree grows fruit because it is a magic tree. Water runs downhill because it is bewitched. The sun shines because it is bewitched. Grimm's Law, named after Joseph Grimm, describes a series of sound changes that occurred in the development of Proto-Germanic from the Proto-Indo-European. The point is that this Grimm is a science-y Grimm. Chesterton says that Grimm's Law is less intellectual than the fairy tales compiled by Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm. The reason for this bold statement is that Grimm's fairy tales are actually tales, while Grimm's Law is not actually a law. You see, the word law implies that we understand the nature of the effects. It can't be called a law if we have simply noticed that there are some effects. We understand the nature of the relationship between a murder and going to prison. You take a life and then you lose the privilege of living in society. The connection between an egg and a chicken is a far bigger leap, and we don't understand why it is so. That's the point. For it to be a law, you need to understand the nature of the transformation. When we don't know the why of it, it's not a law, it's magic. Like what happens in Cinderella. The mice turning into horses, the pumpkin into a carriage. We don't understand the nature of those transformations. It's the same with an egg becoming a chicken. Just because we count on it happening doesn't mean that it must always happen. So when a caterpillar turns into a butterfly, it's much more accurate to describe it as magic than as a law, because we don't understand the general meaning of the spell. How might your experience of life be different if you took this view, that all these arbitrary natural repetitions are evidence of bewitchment? Trees growing fruit, water flowing downhill, and the sun shining. It's all magic. I deny altogether that this is fantastic or even mystical. We may have some mysticism later on, but this fairy tale language about things is simply rational and agnostic. It is the only way I can express in words my clear and definite perception that one thing is quite distinct from another. There is no logical connection between flying and laying eggs. It is the man who talks about a law that he has never seen who is the mystic. Nay, the ordinary scientific man is strictly a sentimentalist. He is a sentimentalist in this essential sense, that he is soaked and swept away by mere associations. He has so often seen birds fly and lay eggs that he feels as if there must be some dreamy, tender connection between the two ideas, whereas there is none. A forlorn lover might be unable to dissociate the moon from lost love, so the materialist is unable to dissociate the moon from the tide. In both cases, there is no connection, except that one has seen them together. A sentimentalist might shed tears at the smell of apple blossom, because by a dark association of his own, it reminded him of his boyhood. So the materialist professor, though he conceals his tears, is yet a sentimentalist, because by a dark association of his own, apple blossoms remind him of apples. But the cool rationalist from fairyland does not see why, in the abstract, the apple tree should not grow crimson tulips. It sometimes does in his country. He can hear his critics already. They say that this is all just a bunch of fantastical, mystical thinking. Chesterton emphatically rejects this accusation and contends that it's pure, simple, indifferent reasoning. It's built on the logical necessity that one thing is not another. An egg is not a chicken. What could be more rational? What's not a logical necessity is that a chicken must come from an egg. The only connection between the two is that they often are seen together, but that doesn't make it a law. The people who call the relationship between an egg and a chicken a law, that's the person who's the mystic, the sentimentalist. That means that their thinking is governed by their emotions, not their heads. They are so taken away by their feelings that they create an imaginary connection between things that have none. Those who have experienced the rationality of fairyland know that it is just as likely that a chicken come out of an egg as a swarm of flies, because there it's happened before. This elementary wonder, however, is not a mere fancy derived from fairy tales. On the contrary, all the fire of fairy tales is derived from this. Just as we all like love tales because there is an instinct of sex, we all like astonishing tales because they touch the nerve of the ancient instinct of astonishment. This is proved by the fact that when we are very young children, we do not need fairy tales. We only need tales. Mere life is interesting enough. A child of 7 is excited by being told that Tommy opened a door and saw a dragon. But a child of 3 is excited by being told that Tommy opened a door. Boys like romantic tales, but babies like realistic tales, because they find them romantic. In fact, a baby is about the only person, I should think, to whom a modern realistic novel could be read without boring him. This proves that even nursery tales only echo an almost prenatal leap of interest and amazement. These tales say that apples were golden only to refresh the forgotten moment when we found that they were green. They make rivers run with wine only to make us remember for one wild moment that they run with water. I have said that this is wholly reasonable and even agnostic. And indeed, on this point, I am all for the higher agnosticism. Its better name is ignorance. We have all read in scientific books, and indeed in all romances, the story of the man who has forgotten his name. This man walks about the streets and can see and appreciate everything, only he cannot remember who he is. Well, every man is that kind of man in the story. Every man has forgotten who he is. One may understand the cosmos, but never the ego. The self is more distant than any star. Thou shalt love the Lord thy God, but thou shalt not know thyself. We are all under the same mental calamity. We have all forgotten our names. We have all forgotten what we really are. All that we call common sense and rationality and practicality and positivism only means that for certain dead levels of our life, we forget that we have forgotten. All that we call spirit and art and ecstasy only means for one awful instant, we remember that we forget. In this paragraph, Chesterton referred to love tales and romances. These are two different things. Love tales are what we call romances, stories about love. But romances are adventure stories, with knights and quests and dragons and that sort of thing. A person that does not see a necessary connection between eggs and chickens or blossoms and apples experiences the world in a way very different from the materialists. They experience wonder. This wonder is not something that comes to us by reading fairy tales. Fairy tales come from this sense of wonder. This is something that is woven into us as human beings. But it can atrophy in us through lack of use. Young children don't need fairy tales to awaken their sense of wonder. Any story will do. They don't need a dragon on the other side of a door. They just need a door. I love that bit about golden apples existing in fairy tales to remind us that they are green. The idea here is, why would we find golden apples more amazing than green apples, or red ones, or yellow ones? It's because we've fallen into a mental haze that has us thinking that these things must be. That an apple exists at all is wonderful. That it comes in different colors is incredible. What is there in the world that if you took a moment to look at it, wouldn't blow your mind away? Again. A while back I made a video about carrots that has almost no views, but I think it's a good one. In our world of science and technology, where we just flip a switch and stuff happens, we lose the magic that is a carrot. A link to that video will be in the description. It's a big problem that we don't see the magic. It means we've forgotten who we are. But though, like the man without memory in the novel, we walk the streets with a sort of half-witted admiration. Still, it is admiration. It is admiration in English and not only admiration in Latin. The wonder has a positive element of praise. This is the next milestone to be definitely marked on our road through fairyland. I shall speak in the next chapter about optimists and pessimists in their intellectual aspect, so far as they have one. Here I am only trying to describe the enormous emotions which cannot be described. And the strongest emotion was that life was as precious as it was puzzling. It was an ecstasy because it was an adventure. It was an adventure because it was an opportunity. The goodness of the fairy tale was not affected by the fact that there might be more dragons than princesses. It was good to be in a fairy tale. The test of all happiness is gratitude, and I felt grateful, though I hardly knew to whom. Children are grateful when Santa Claus puts in their stockings gifts of toys or sweets. Could I not be grateful to Santa Claus when he put in my stockings the gift of 2 miraculous legs? We thank people for birthday presents of cigars and slippers. Can I thank no one for the birthday present of birth? One of the effects of seeing magic, in carrots for instance, is gratitude. When we see the world through the lenses of wonder, life becomes precious. When life is precious, you are grateful for it. Sure, there are as many dragons as there are princes and princesses, maybe more. But even those nasty things don't take away from being in the fairy tale in the first place. Life itself is a privilege. He was grateful, but to whom? He did not yet know. There were then these 2 first feelings, indefensible and indisputable. The world was a shock, but it was not merely shocking. Existence was a surprise, but it was a pleasant surprise. In fact, all my first views were exactly uttered in a riddle that stuck in my brain from boyhood. The question was, what did the first frog say? And the answer was, Lord, how you made me jump. That says succinctly all that I am saying. God made the frog jump, but the frog prefers jumping. But when these things are settled, there enters the second great principle of the fairy philosophy. The first 2 feelings that Chesterton had was wonder and gratitude. The worldview of Elfland or fairy tales reminds us that the world that we live in is not a lifeless machine slavishly obeying impersonal laws of cause and effect. It's a world of mysteries and possibilities and wonder. If the world were a boring old machine following unbreakable laws, then it's completely appropriate to be indifferent or bored by the world. But if it's a surprise filled with magic, then our natural response ought to be gratitude. Can you see what kind of difference looking at the world through these fairy lenses would make? Walking around in awe and wonder and gratitude all day long? In the third part of the Ethics of Elfland, Chesterton will discuss one of the foundational truths of fairyland that we've forgotten and we need to recover. Thank you, and we'll see you there.